Welcome back to the deep dive. Usually when we talk about ancient texts or religious history, people's eyes can kind of glaze over.
Right.
They expect a long list of kings, some dusty dates, maybe a few pottery shards.
Yeah, a dry history lesson.
But today, the source material we are covering reads like the season finale of a high-stakes political thriller. I'm talking about a dynasty, unchecked power, corruption at the absolute highest levels, and a catastrophic fall that literally changed the course of a nation.
It really does have all those elements of a modern tragedy. Or, I don't know, maybe something like Succession or House of Cards, but, set in the Bronze Age.
Exactly.
What makes this particular deep dive so compelling is that we're dealing with the collapse of a spiritual institution from the inside out. It's not an outside army that rots to the core. It's the people running the show.
And that's what's so fascinating. We are looking at the story of Hophni and Phinehas. Now, if those names sound a bit obscure to you, don't worry. They were priests, the sons of the high priest Eli, and they were entrusted with the most sacred duties in ancient Israel.
They were the establishment.
They were. But the source material we are covering today, an article by Brother Woody Brom titled Hophni and Phinehas, Sons of Eli and Priests Who Faced God's Judgment, introduces them with a much darker title. It calls them Sons of Belial.
Which is a remarkably heavy phrase. We shouldn't just glaze over that. In the ancient Hebrew context, calling someone a son of Belial isn't just, calling them a bad apple.
Right. It's more than that.
Oh, much more. It essentially marks them as worthless, wicked, or destructive. It implies a person who has thrown off all restraint. The source makes it clear. These men, despite wearing the priestly robes, had absolutely no regard for the Lord they were supposed to be serving.
That's quite a twist for men working in the tabernacle. So our mission today is to analyze this collapse, which is recorded in 1 Samuel chapters 2 through 4. We really want to understand, how does a spiritual institution rot? How do you go from being the center of national worship to a smoking ruin in a single day?
And to do that, we have to look at the intersection of three things the source highlights: human weakness, deep spiritual corruption, and what it calls God's uncompromising holiness.
Okay.
And when those three things collide, you don't get a quiet resolution, you get an explosion.
It's intense stuff. We've got greed, we've got sex scandals, we've got war, and a truly tragic death.
It is dramatic, certainly. But as we go through this, I think it's important to remember the tone our source sets. This isn't just sensational history or, gossip from 3,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Brahm describes it as a solemn warning and a cautionary tale for every generation. This is about what happens when leadership fails and when the sacred is treated as common.
Okay, so let's unpack this.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand how bad things got, we have to understand where we are in history.
Mm-hmm.
Because context is everything.
It really is.
Set the scene for us.
We are at the tail end of what's known as the Age of the Judges. Now, if you know your biblical history, you know this was a period of absolute transition and turbulence. There was no king yet, no central government, no standing army, no police force.
So just a loose collection of tribes.
A tribal confederacy, exactly. And it was an era characterized by profound instability, constant threats from outside, and constant fighting on the inside.
The source mentions a haunting refrain that it says sums up this entire era. Every man did what was right in his own eyes.
That phrase really chills you when you think about it. It sounds like freedom,
Right.
Doing what's right in your own eyes. It sounds like modern individualism. But in practice, for a society, it means anarchy. It means there is no objective standard. If my version of right involves taking your land and there's no authority to stop me,
It's just chaos.
it's total chaos. The nation was drifting spiritually, longing for stability, but completely unable to find it.
So you have this swirling chaos, this violent world. And in the middle of it, you have one location that is supposed to be the anchor, the calm in the storm.
Shiloh.
Tell us about Shiloh. What would you see if you walked in there?
Shiloh was the central sanctuary. This wasn't a stone temple like you'd see later in Jerusalem, not yet. This was where the tabernacle, the tent of meeting, was pitched.
The portable temple from the wilderness.
Exactly. But more importantly, this is where the Ark of the Covenant rested.
And we have to clarify this for everyone because the Ark is going to be the pivot point of this whole tragedy. This isn't just a golden box from a movie. It's not a museum piece.
Right. In the theology of ancient Israel, the Ark was the visible sign of God's dwelling among his people. It was seen as the footstool of the invisible God.
So it's the center of everything.
It's the spiritual and, in many ways, the political center. Shiloh was where you went to offer sacrifices, to fulfill your vows, to find forgiveness. It was the heartbeat of the nation's relationship with God.
So conceptually, you have this chaotic world outside where everyone is doing whatever they want, and Shiloh is supposed to be the bulwark of holiness. That's the ideal.
Precisely. That's the ideal. The priesthood, specifically the family of Aaron, was entrusted with being that bulwark. They were the mediators. They stood between a holy God and a flawed nation.
What was their job description exactly?
Their job was to teach the commandments and, crucially, to model devotion. They were supposed to show the people what it looked like to reverence God.
And at the top of this hierarchy, we have Eli. He's the high priest, and he's also a judge. I mean, he's a big deal.
He is a prominent leader. He's been judging Israel for 40 years, but the source makes a very specific note about his condition at the time of this story.
Yeah.
It mentions his advancing years and his failing strength. Eli is old. He's 98. And importantly, his eyesight is failing. He's physically and perhaps, metaphorically going blind. Because of that, he has become dependent.
He's relying on his sons, Hophni and Phinehas, to carry the torch, to run the day-to-day operations.
Exactly. And that is where the conflict begins. You have a nation weakened in its loyalty to God, and the one place that should be pure, the sanctuary, is being marred by the very men charged with protecting it.
So instead of honoring the calling, the sons are bringing shame upon it.
Complete and utter shame.
Let's get into the specifics of that shame.
Yeah.
Because the source doesn't just say they were bad guys. It gives us the receipts. It calls them sons of Belial, which you mentioned means they had no regard for the Lord. But this wasn't just an internal attitude problem.
No.
They were running actual rackets out of the tabernacle.
They were. The corruption manifested in two very shocking ways. The first was what you might call the meat racket.
The meat racket.
They were exploiting the sacrificial system for personal gain.
Okay, walk us through how this was supposed to work versus what they were actually doing. Because I think for a modern listener, the mechanics of animal sacrifice can be a bit foreign.
Sure. So the law of Moses was very clear. When you brought a certain kind of offering, a peace offering, the animal was slain. The fat, specifically the suet around the organs, was to be burned on the altar first.
Okay, why the fat?
The fat was seen as God's portion. It represented the best part, the energy of the animal. It was a sign of giving the very best to God.
So God gets served first.
Always.
Yeah.
After the fat was burned, the priest was given specific cuts, usually the breast and the right thigh, to boil and eat. That was their salary, essentially, their provision for serving.
Seems fair. God's portion, then the priest's portion.
That is the divine order, reverence, then sustenance. But Hophni and Phinehas reversed the order. They sent their servants to the worshippers and demanded the choicest portions of the meat before the fat was burned.
Before.
And not only that, they often wanted it raw so they could roast it, rather than boiled as the law required. They wanted it their way.
That's incredibly arrogant. It's like inviting a king to a banquet and eating off his plate before he even sits down.
That's a perfect analogy. It's a statement of contempt. They're saying, my appetite is more important than God's honor.
And they weren't polite about it, were they?
No, not at all. The source describes them sending servants, essentially their henchmen, with these big three-pronged forks to just seize the meat right out of the pot.
Wow.
And if the worshiper protested, if they said, no, let the fat be burned first, as the law commands, the servant would respond with a threat.
A threat of violence.
Yes.
In the tabernacle.
Yes. The threat was, give it to me now, or I will take it by force.
So you're an Israelite. You've traveled for days to get to Shiloh to offer sacrifice, maybe out of gratitude or repentance. You are trying to do the right thing in a chaotic world. You want to honor God. And instead of a holy experience, you are met with strong-arm tactics. Give me the meat or I take it by force.
It turns worship into a shakedown.
A protection racket.
Exactly. The source says it shifted the atmosphere from reverence and gratitude to greed and intimidation. They were serving themselves before God. It's a complete inversion of what a priest is supposed to be. They were treating the offerings of the people as their own private buffet.
And unfortunately, it didn't stop with greed. There was a second crime, which the source describes as even more scandalous.
This is where it gets truly dark. This goes beyond just financial corruption. They were engaging in sexual immorality with the women who served at the entrance to the tabernacle.
Talk about desecration. I mean, where was this happening?
Right there, at the entrance to the holy place. It's hard to overstate how offensive this was in that context. This wasn't just a private sin committed in secret.
Wow.
This was happening at the very gateway to the courts of God's dwelling. These were spaces intended for prayer, for holiness, for dedication.
And they turned it into a place of, as the source says, unrestrained desires.
Right. They defiled the sanctuary itself. So when you combine these two things, the theft of the sacrifices and the sexual immorality, you see a pattern.
A pattern of contempt.
Complete contempt. The source summarizes it perfectly. These actions demonstrated a complete disregard for the presence of God. They didn't just break rules. They acted as if God wasn't there or, simply didn't matter. They were practical atheists in priestly robes.
Which brings us to the man in charge, Eli. He's the high priest. He's the father. He had to know this was happening, right? This couldn't have been a secret.
He absolutely knew. The source says reports were spreading among all the people. You can't run a racket like that and have it stay a secret. The whole nation knew. The rumors were everywhere.
So what does he do?
Well, Eli confronts them. He does speak up.
Okay.
He calls them in. He says, "Why do you do such things? I hear of your evil dealings from all the people." He rebukes them verbally. But, and here is the critical flaw that the source points out, words were all he gave.
That's a stinging critique. Words were all he gave.
It is. The source argues that Eli's passivity became part of the sin. You have to remember, Eli wasn't just their dad. He was the high priest of Israel. He had the authority and the duty to remove them from their office.
He could have fired them.
He could have fired them, banned them from the service, excommunicated them. He had the power to stop the abuse.
But he didn't.
No, he didn't. He left them in power. And that brings up a massive leadership principle here, one the source really leans into. Leadership demands action, not just counsel.
Right.
If you have someone in your organization or your family who is actively destroying the mission or the integrity of the home, and you just give them a stern talking to, but leave them in a position to keep doing damage, you are complicit.
That's a tough pill to swallow. Passivity is sin. It feels like he was prioritizing being a nice dad over being a faithful high priest.
That's a good way to put it. He feared the conflict with his sons more than he feared the corruption of God's house. And because of this refusal to act, the situation escalated. It went from a human problem to a divine intervention.
This is where the prophet shows up.
Yes. A man of God, an unnamed prophet, arrives with a message directly for Eli, and the charge is devastating.
What is the charge?
The charge is that Eli honored his sons above God. That is the core indictment. By letting them continue, by partaking of the very sacrifices they stole, he was putting their feelings, their status, their comfort ahead of the holiness of the sanctuary.
And the sentence.
The sentence is that the continuity of the priesthood is withdrawn from his line. His family's dynasty is over. But there's a specific sign given to prove this is real, something that can't be mistaken for coincidence.
Was the sign.
The prophet says that both Hophni and Phinehas will die on the same day.
Wow. And there's a theological maxim here that the source highlights, kind of the principle behind the judgment.
Yes, those who honor me I will honor, but those who despise me will be lightly esteemed.
Lightly esteemed. That sounds almost mild.
It sounds mild, but it's one of the scariest verses in Scripture if you think about it. In Hebrew, the word for glory or honor is related to the word for weight, for heaviness. To be lightly esteemed means you have no weight. You are insignificant. You are like chaff that just blows away. God is essentially saying, you treated me as if I don't matter, so I will treat you the same way.
So the clock is ticking. The prophecy has been delivered. The warning shots have been fired. Now we move to the day it all comes crashing down. The day of disaster.
And it starts at the battle.
Right. The tension finally breaks. Israel goes to war against their primary enemy at the time, the Philistines.
This was the major geopolitical threat. The Philistines were technologically superior. They had iron weapons while Israel was still largely in the Bronze Age. They were aggressive, organized, and expanding.
And Israel is desperate for a victory.
Desperate, but they lose the first skirmish, right?
They do. Badly.
Yeah.
About 4,000 men die. And the elders of Israel come back to camp and they ask a very good question. They ask, why did the Lord defeat us today?
Which is a valid question. It's the right question to ask.
It is, but they come up with the absolute wrong solution. Instead of looking inward, instead of repenting for the corruption in Shiloh, which everyone knew about, they make a fatal mistake.
They come up with a tactical solution for a spiritual problem.
Exactly. They decide to bring the Ark of the Covenant into the camp.
So they're going to bring their superweapon to the front lines.
Now, on the surface, this might look like an act of faith. We need God, let's bring the Ark. But looking deeper, and as the expert analysis in our source points out, They were treating the ark as a talisman of power.
Exactly. It's the magic box syndrome. They thought the physical object itself would save them. It was superstition, not faith.
It's like having a lucky rabbit's foot.
A very holy, very powerful rabbit's foot. They were trying to manipulate God. The logic was something like, God loves his ark. If we put the ark on the front lines, God has to fight for us to protect his own furniture.
They were trying to trap God into giving them a victory.
And look who they sent with it. Hophni and Phinehas, these corrupt priests, accompanied the ark. So you have the holiest object on earth being carried by the two most wicked men in Israel.
A total contradiction.
It's a disaster waiting to happen. They ignored the spiritual reality, that they had abandoned God, and tried to use his symbol to force a win. It's the idea that we have the box, so we win.
But God is not a tool to be used.
Not at all. And the result was catastrophic. The source says the Lord was not with them. Now, interestingly, when the ark arrived in the Israelite camp, they let out a huge shout, and the Philistines heard it and were terrified.
They knew what the ark represented.
They did. They shouted, "A god has come into the camp, woe to us." But instead of running away, that fear actually made them fight harder. Their commanders basically said, "Fight like men or you'll become their slaves." They fought for their lives.
And the result was a slaughter.
A crushing victory for the Philistines. The stats are staggering. 30,000 Israelite foot soldiers fallen.
30,000. That's a massive portion of the fighting-age male population at the time.
It's a generational wipeout. It's a national catastrophe. And in the midst of that chaos, the sign given to Eli comes to pass.
Hophni and Phinehas.
Hophni and Phinehas are killed, probably right there next to the ark they were pretending to protect.
But that wasn't even the worst part, was it?
No, that was a personal tragedy, but the national tragedy was worse. The ultimate loss, the thing that humiliated Israel and left them bereft, as the source puts it, was that the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines.
Just pause on that for a second.
Mm.
The ark. The sign of God's presence.
Yeah.
Taken by pagans.
It's unthinkable. It would be like, I don't know, the equivalent of a nation's capital being sacked and its most sacred monument being carried off as a trophy. It meant the glory had departed. It meant God chose to let his throne go into exile rather than defend a corrupt people.
So now we cut back to Shiloh. The battle is over, the smoke is rising, and old Eli is waiting for news.
This scene is just cinematic in its tragedy. Eli is 98 years old, he's blind, he's heavy, and he's sitting on a seat by the side of the gate listening. The text says his heart trembled for the Ark of God.
Not for his sons, for the ark.
For the Ark, that's a key detail. He's more worried about the symbol of God's presence than his own family.
A messenger comes running in from the battle, clothes torn, dirt on his head, the classic signs of mourning and defeat.
He runs into the town first, and a cry goes up from the people. Eli hears the commotion and asks what's happening. The messenger comes to Eli and delivers the news in a brutal, escalating list of horrors.
One by one.
First, Israel has fled before the Philistines. Bad news. Second, there has also been a great slaughter among the people. Worse news. Third, your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, are also dead. Devastating news for a father.
Any one of those is a blow. But the source is very, very specific about what triggered Eli's death.
Yes, it wasn't the death of his sons that killed him. The messenger adds the fourth and final point, and the Ark of God has been captured.
And what happens when Eli hears that?
The shock was so great that when he heard the news about the Ark, he fell backward from his seat by the gate.
Just falls right over.
And because he was heavy and old and the fall was violent, his neck broke and he died instantly.
In a single day.
In a single day. The prophecy was fulfilled. The house of Eli collapsed completely. His sons were dead. He was dead. The priesthood, as they knew it, was wiped out. It's a total dismantling of the regime.
A complete and total collapse. So what does this all mean? Let's move into the theological breakdown. After the dust settles, what are the big lessons? The source highlights a few key themes that emerge from the rubble. The first one is obviously the holiness of God.
This is the bedrock of the entire story. I mean, the number one takeaway is that God is not mocked. The source emphasizes that divine holiness is not negotiable.
What does that mean, not negotiable?
It means you can't manipulate the things of God, whether that's the sacrifices, the sanctuary, or the ark itself, for your own pleasure or power. We tend to have this very casual, manageable view of God, but this story reminds us he is, in the biblical language, a consuming fire.
It's a stark reminder that intent matters.
Ugh.
You can't just go through the motions or use the brand of religion while living in a way that fundamentally insults its core principles.
Precisely, and that connects directly to the second theme, the stewardship of leadership. The source calls the priesthood a sacred stewardship, not just a family inheritance.
That's a key distinction. An inheritance is something you own. A stewardship is something you manage for someone else.
Right. If I inherit a house, I can do what I want with it. I can paint it pink, I can knock down a wall. But if I'm a steward of a historic estate, I answer to the owner. My job is to preserve it.
And Hophni and Phinehas treated the priesthood like an inheritance.
Exactly. Something they owned and could exploit for meat and women. But leaders are responsible for their example. And the source notes that when leaders fall, the damage is multiplied.
It wasn't just Hophni and Phinehas who suffered.
No. 30,000 Israelites died. The ark was lost. The nation was demoralized for a generation. A leader's sin has a blast radius. It never just affects them.
And that leads to the third point, which really circles back to Eli. The necessity of discipline. We talked about his failure earlier, but the source puts it in a really interesting way. Love that refuses correction is not love at all.
That's a powerful statement, isn't it? We often think of love as being soft or permissive. I love him too much to say anything.
The desire to avoid conflict.
Right. But in this context, Eli's softness was actually cruelty. It was cruel to the nation who was being abused by his sons. It was cruel to God's honor. And ultimately, it was cruel to his own sons because it confirmed them in a path that led to their destruction.
So leadership that hesitates to confront sin dishonors God.
And it destroys the very people you're trying to protect. It's a lose-lose situation.
Now, the source takes a bit of a turn here in section 6. It moves from the Old Testament history to a more specific Christian theology. It starts talking about the greater priest.
Yes, this is where Brother Brome connects the historical narrative to the broader biblical arc. He argues that the failure of Eli's house serves a specific purpose in the text. It points to the need for a greater priest, one who won't fail.
So it's a typology, a contrast. The failure of the human system highlights the need for a divine one.
Exactly. The source contrasts Hophni and Phinehas directly with Jesus Christ. It presents Christ as the one who cannot fail.
What are some of the specific contrasts it draws?
Well, think about what we just discussed. Hophni and Phinehas corrupted the altar. The source says Christ sanctified it with his own sacrifice. They indulged their own desires and took what wasn't theirs. Christ offered perfect obedience and gave of himself. They demanded that the people serve them. Christ came to serve.
So their disgrace kind of acts as a foil, a dark background, that makes his glory shine brighter by contrast.
That's the theological conclusion of the source. It presents a redeemer who would never fail, standing in the gap where the human priesthood completely and utterly collapsed. It suggests that human institutions, even God-ordained ones, will always eventually fail because they are run by flawed people, which points to the need for a perfect divine solution.
Okay, let's bring this home. Moving to modern application, because we always want to know, so what? Why does a story about ancient priests and meat forks matter to the learner listening today?
The source offers a few angles here. First, for anyone in any kind of sacred work or leadership, and that could mean you're a pastor, a nonprofit leader, a teacher, or even just leading a family, it's a warning against casualness.
Don't phone it in.
Don't phone it in, and don't assume that your position protects you. There is a profound danger in familiarity. Hophni and Phinehas grew up in the tabernacle. They saw the miracles, they knew the rituals inside and out, but they lost their awe.
They became numb to the holy.
Exactly. That's a huge danger in any field, really. When you become so expert at something or so used to it that you lose your respect for the fundamentals.
That's a great point. What's the second application?
The second is about the spread of sin. We touched on this, but it's worth reiterating. Sin doesn't remain isolated. It started with greed and lust in two men. It ended with national defeat and the loss of the most sacred object in the nation.
It's the ripple effect. Or maybe a cancer analogy.
It is. If you tolerate corruption in a small corner of your organization or your life, don't be surprised when it metastasizes and eats the whole structure. You have to cut it out early.
But the source doesn't end on a totally depressing note. There is hope mentioned.
That's right. And this is crucial. The story didn't end with the death of Eli and the capture of the ark. The source reminds us that God was already preparing the next chapter. He raised up Samuel, that little boy who was serving faithfully in the background while all this corruption was happening.
One who heard God's voice when Eli couldn't.
Exactly. And after Samuel came King David. The failure of the leaders didn't mean the failure of God's plan.
Human failure is real, but divine faithfulness is greater. That's the expert insight provided.
That's the hopeful takeaway. Even in the wreckage of Shiloh, God was preparing the next step. His purposes were not defeated by human sin.
It's a fascinating duality. It's a story of terrible judgment, but it's also a clearing of the deck for redemption. Sometimes the old, corrupt structure has to fall for new life to begin.
It is. It's from the courts of Shiloh to a nation shaken, but ultimately leading toward a new era.
Before we wrap up, I will leave you with one final thought, something to really mull over. We mentioned it briefly, but it really stuck with me. The source is very clear that Eli died from shock, but not because his sons died.
No, it was because the ark was lost.
And I think that raises a provocative question for us. In our own lives, in our leadership, what are we actually most afraid of losing? Are we more concerned with the preservation of our sons, our personal legacies, our comforts, our reputation, our little dynasties?
Or institutions.
Or are we concerned with the ark, the integrity of the truth, the mission, the core values that we're supposed to be protecting?
That is the question. Eli, in his final moment, got the priority right. His heart broke for the right reason.
Exactly. But what if he had lived with that priority sooner? If he had cared about the ark more than his sons when they were alive and desecrating it, the story might have been very, very different.
A powerful thought to end on. Prioritize the ark while you still have time to protect it.
Indeed. That's all for this deep dive. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.